The cold was a physical thing, a predator that had been stalking the high plains for a week. It was not the clean, crisp cold of a winter postcard, but a sullen, grinding cold that sank its teeth into the frozen mud of the town's only street and refused to let go. It made a man's breath hang in the air like a ghost of a word he wished he'd never spoken, and it leached the color from the sky, leaving a bruised, indifferent gray that pressed down on the clapboard buildings with a palpable weight. The wind was its accomplice, a keening misery that found every crack in every wall, every gap in a man's collar, whispering of starvation and the deep, dreamless sleep of the frozen. Against the wall of the general store, where the overhang offered a sliver of protection from the wind's worst abuses, they huddled. A woman and a boy. They were specters at the edge of the town's vision, figures so steeped in desperation they had become nearly invisible. The townspeople, wrapped in thick wool and righteous necessity, bustled past, their eyes sliding over the pair as if they were no more than a smudge on the landscape. The woman's clothes were a tragedy of poor planning, a thin dress and a shawl more suited to a temperate autumn than this brutal, high-altitude winter. Her skin, a shade darker than the sun and wind-chapped faces of the locals, marked her as an outsider, a piece of flotsam washed up on a hostile shore. Her hands were tucked under her arms, and her face was a mask of stoic endurance, but her eyes, dark and deep, held a terror that was as vast and cold as the landscape itself. The boy, no more than 7, pressed against her side, a small, shivering bundle of bones. He wore a man's coat, crudely cut down, its sleeves still comically long. His face was a miniature of his mother's, the same fine bones and dark eyes, but his mask was not as practiced. A tremor ran through him, a constant, shivering hum that she could feel vibrating through her own body. They had not spoken for hours. There was nothing left to say. Their pleas had been met with slammed doors and averted gazes. Their last few coins had bought a stale loaf of bread 2 days ago. Now, there was only the cold and the silence and the gnawing emptiness in their bellies. A wagon creaked to a halt in front of the store, the sound of the brake lever a loud groan in the frigid air. A man swung down from the driver's seat. He was a solid, deliberate shape, a man carved from the same hard materials as the land itself. His coat was sheepskin, worn and stained, and his hat was pulled low, its brim casting his face in shadow. He moved with an economy that spoke of a life lived without excess, each step measured, each motion with purpose. He did not seem to feel the cold. He simply existed within it, another of its grim features. He tied his horses to the hitching post, his movements sure and unhurried. As he turned toward the store, his gaze passed over the town, the closed-off faces, the hurried steps. Then his eyes found the woman and the boy. He stopped. It was not a dramatic pause, just a cessation of movement. His head tilted slightly. Most people looked through them. He looked at them. His gaze was not one of pity, which they had come to dread, nor of contempt, which they had come to expect. It was a quiet, searching attention, the way a man might study a crack in a foundation or a worrisome cloud on the horizon. He noted the thinness of her shawl, the boy's uncontrollable shivering, the stark, abject poverty that clung to them like frost. He saw the pride in the straightness of her spine and the desperation warring with it in the clench of her jaw. He stood there for a long moment, a statue in the biting wind. The woman felt his gaze like a physical touch and forced herself to meet it, lifting her chin in a gesture of defiance that cost her more than he could know. She expected him to turn away, to dismiss them and enter the warmth of the store. Instead, he took a slow step toward them. Then another. He stopped a few feet away, his shadow falling over them. The silence stretched, pulled taut by the wind. "The storm's coming back," he said. His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. It was not a question or a pleasantry. It was a statement of fact. Another 3 days of this. Maybe more. The woman did not reply. She held his gaze, her heart a cold, hard knot in her chest. He looked from her to the boy, whose shivering had intensified under the scrutiny. "He won't last another night out here again," a fact, delivered without emotion. He looked back at her. "I have a ranch. North of here. It's isolated. I need a cook. Someone to mend. The work is hard." He paused, his eyes unwavering. "I offer a roof, a fire, food, in exchange for the work." It was not an act of charity. It was a transaction, laid bare and stripped of all sentiment. It was a choice between the slow, certain death of freezing on a public street and an unknown future with this hard, silent man. The offer was as sharp and dangerous as the winter itself, yet it was also the only warmth that had been extended to them in weeks. She studied his face, what she could see of it in the shadow of his hat. It was a face weathered by sun and solitude, etched with lines that spoke of hardship, not cruelty. There was a profound emptiness in his eyes, a hollowed-out look she recognized, for she saw it in her own reflection sometimes. It was the look of a man who had lost something fundamental. "We will work," she said, her voice a dry whisper, but the words were firm. It was a statement, not a plea, an acceptance of terms. He gave a single, sharp nod. "Get in the wagon." He turned without another word and went into the general store. He was inside for no more than 10 minutes. The woman watched the door, a new kind of fear coiling in her gut, the fear of hope. She helped the boy to his feet, his small body stiff and clumsy with cold. They stood by the wagon, waiting, two displaced statues in the vast, uncaring landscape. When the man emerged, he carried a heavy sack of flour over one shoulder and a crate of tinned goods in his arms. He loaded them into the back of the wagon with practiced ease, then turned to them. He did not offer to help her up. He simply waited, his presence a silent command. She hoisted the boy into the wagon bed, his small weight feeling alarmingly slight, then climbed in after him. The man retrieved a thick, greasy-smelling horse blanket from under his seat and tossed it into the back. "Use that," he commanded, and then he climbed onto the driver's bench. He did not look back to see if they had followed his instruction. He simply unwrapped the reins from the brake handle, clucked his tongue, and the wagon lurched forward, leaving the hostile little town behind. The journey was a descent into a deeper, more profound silence. The only sounds were the groaning of the wagon wheels on the frozen ruts, the rhythmic plodding of the horses, and the ceaseless whine of the wind. The landscape grew starker, the rolling plains giving way to jagged hills and sparse, skeletal trees. The man did not speak. He did not look back. He was a figure of pure forward momentum, his attention fixed on the path ahead. In the back, the woman wrapped the rough blanket around herself and the boy. The wool was coarse and smelled of horse and sweat, but it was a barrier against the wind's sharpest teeth. The boy, exhausted by the cold and the sudden, shocking change in their fortunes, soon fell into a fitful sleep, his head resting in her lap. She stayed awake, her body rigid with a tension that was part fear, part vigilance. She watched the man's broad back, the set of his shoulders, the way he held the reins with a loose, confident grip. He was their savior and their captor, a mystery carved from silence and stone. The kindness he had shown, if it could be called that, felt impersonal, a pragmatic solution to an equation he had observed. They were a necessity he had acquired, like the flour and the tinned goods. As twilight bled its last gray light from the sky, a shape emerged from the gloom. A single cabin, with a barn and a set of corrals, all huddled together as if for warmth against the immensity of the surrounding wilderness. There were no other signs of life for miles in any direction. This was a kingdom of isolation, and he was its solitary king. He brought the wagon to a stop near the cabin door and was on the ground before the wheels had fully ceased their turning. "We're here." The cabin, when he pushed the door open, was dark and cold, but it was a cold without wind. He moved through the single large room with a familiar, cat-like grace, lighting a lantern on the central table. The light bloomed, pushing the shadows back to the corners, revealing a space that was brutally simple. A stone hearth dominated one wall. A rough-hewn table and two chairs stood in the center. A bed was built into one corner, a simple frame with a thin mattress. Everything was scoured clean, obsessively neat, but profoundly empty. It was the home of a man who did not live in it so much as occupy it. There were no pictures, no decorations, no clutter of personal life. It was a place of function, not comfort. A silence lived in this cabin that was different from the silence outside. It was older, heavier, and it was becoming too loud to bear. He built a fire in the hearth with swift, efficient movements, and soon a hungry warmth began to push back against the room's deep chill. He filled a pot with water from a bucket by the door and hung it over the flames. then began to cut vegetables and salted meat into it with a large knife. He worked without speaking, his focus absolute. The woman and the boy stood just inside the door, uncertain, displaced. The sudden warmth was a shock to their systems, making their frozen limbs ache and their heads swim. The smell of the stew was an agony, a promise so potent it was almost unbearable. When the man finally spoke, his voice made them both jump. "There's a loft," he said, gesturing with his knife toward a ladder on the far wall. "You'll sleep there." She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. When the stew was ready, he ladled it into 3 wooden bowls. He set 2 on the table and carried the third to the hearth, where he sat on the stone ledge, eating by himself. He gestured for them to sit. For a moment, they hesitated. Then the boy, driven by a hunger that eclipsed all other feelings, scrambled to the table. The woman followed. They ate with a ravenous, desperate speed that was shameful, but they could not help it. The hot, salty broth was life itself, a miracle in a bowl. They did not speak, did not look up, until every last drop was gone. The man watched them from his place by the fire. He ate slowly, his expression unreadable, a detached curiosity in his gaze that made her skin prickle. He was observing a natural phenomenon, like watching starving wolves on a carcass. The meal highlighted the vast gulf between their states of being. For him, it was sustenance. For them, it was resurrection. After they had eaten, he took their bowls, rinsed them in a basin, and set them aside. The clear physical and emotional separation was a wall between them. He had provided for their immediate needs, and now the terms of their arrangement were implicitly clear. He was not their host. He was their master. "The work begins tomorrow," he said, his back to them. And with that, he went to his own bed, pulled a blanket over himself, and turned his face to the wall. The woman guided the boy to the ladder. The loft was a dark, cramped space under the eaves, filled with the scent of dried herbs and dust. A pile of clean, empty sacks lay in one corner. She arranged them into a makeshift bed, and they lay down together, pulling more sacks over themselves for warmth. The heat from the fire below rose, making the space bearable. The boy was asleep almost instantly, his small body finally warm and full. But the woman lay awake for a long time, listening to the sounds of the cabin, the crackle of the fire, the sigh of the wind against the roof, and the quiet, steady breathing of the silent man below. The safety she felt was fragile, conditional, and it felt as sharp and dangerous as the winter itself. They were snowed in for the next 4 days. The storm he had predicted returned with a vengeance, burying the world in a sea of white. The cabin became their entire universe, a small wooden island in a tempest. During this period of confinement, they began to learn each other's silent rhythms. The man was never still. He rose before dawn, his movements quiet but purposeful. He would tend the fire, check on the animals in the attached shed, and then occupy himself with the endless tasks of maintenance. He mended harnesses, sharpened tools, planed a warped board for a loose shutter. He was a man at war with entropy, and his restlessness filled the small space. The woman, after the first morning of uncertainty, found her own rhythm. She took over the cooking without being asked, her movements in the small kitchen space becoming more confident. She discovered his meager stores and made them last, producing simple, hearty meals that stretched the salt meat and dried beans. She found a stash of worn-out shirts and trousers, and a sewing kit with needles and thread. She spent hours by the fire, mending, her fingers nimble and sure. She was not idle. She was making a statement. She would not be a sheltered pet. She would be a contributor. The boy, once his strength returned, was a quiet, observant shadow. He followed the man with his eyes, watching him work with a solemn curiosity. The man, for his part, mostly ignored the child, though once, when the boy got too close to a newly sharpened axe head, he reached out a hand, not to touch the boy, but to move the tool to a higher shelf, a gesture of impersonal, practical safety. Section When the storm finally broke, it left behind a world of stunning, blinding white. The sky was a brilliant, aching blue, and the snow lay in deep, sculpted drifts. The environmental challenge presented itself immediately. The paths to the barn and the well were buried, and the corrals needed to be dug out. The man pulled on his heavy coat and boots, preparing to face the labor alone. "We will help," the woman said from behind him. He turned, his expression skeptical. She was small, and the boy was a child. The snow was deep and heavy. "This is not work for you," he said. It was not a dismissal, but a practical assessment. "We will not be a burden," she insisted, her chin high. "We will earn our place here." He looked at her for a long moment, at the quiet defiance in her eyes. He saw that for her, this was not about help. It was about dignity. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. "There are smaller shovels in the barn." He had expected them to last an hour. He was wrong. The woman worked with a steady, relentless pace, her small frame belying a surprising strength and stamina. She did not try to lift too much at once, instead using a smart, efficient scooping motion that tired her less. The boy, armed with a small grain scoop, worked beside her, clearing the lighter powder from the tops of the drifts his mother broke apart. They worked all day, speaking little, their breaths pluming in the frigid air. The man watched them as he worked, a new, grudging respect dawning in him. They were not fragile. They were resilient. They were survivors, just like him. He found himself adjusting his own pace to hers, working alongside her to clear the main path to the barn. He offered no words of praise, but he showed her a gruff patience, pointing out the best way to lever heavy, compacted snow without straining her back. That evening, as she was putting away some mended clothes, she opened a small wooden trunk at the foot of his bed, looking for a place to store them. Inside, beneath a layer of neatly folded woolens, was a small, crudely carved wooden bird and a faded, dog-eared drawing of a smiling woman and a little girl with impossibly yellow hair, signed in a child's scrawl. The question, sharp as a shard of glass, formed in her mind, but she quickly closed the lid, a feeling of trespassing washing over her. She said nothing, but the image of the drawing, of the life that had once filled this empty house, settled in her heart like a stone. She understood the silence now. It was not empty, it was full of ghosts. Weeks turned into a month. The brutal winter slowly began to lose its grip. The woman and the boy became part of the ranch's ecosystem. She was no longer just a cook. She was a partner in the homestead's survival. She learned the rhythms of the animals, the needs of the small garden. She insisted on planting in a protected patch of earth. Her intelligence was a quiet, constant presence. She reorganized the pantry, inventoried supplies, and her careful management made their resources stretch further than the man had thought possible. He found his life, which had been a solitary line of work and grief, now had texture. There was the sound of the boy's soft humming as he played, the smell of baking bread, the quiet presence of the woman mending by the firelight. The silence in his cabin was changing. It was becoming a better kind of silence. The necessity of a trip to town finally became unavoidable. They were low on salt, flour, and coffee. The man was hesitant. Their last visit had been one of desperation. This one would be different. They would be seen together, not as a rescuer and the rescued, but as a household. He knew what the town's tongues would make of it. He announced the trip in his usual clipped manner. "We're going to town for supplies." He looked at the woman. "You should come. Tell me what you need for the kitchen." It was a practical request, but it felt like something more. A test. An acknowledgement. The town was just as they had left it, but this time, they did not arrive as invisible paupers. They arrived in the man's solid wagon, a unit. The stares they received were no longer dismissive. They were sharp, curious, and edged with malice. Whispers followed them like stray dogs as they walked toward the general store. The woman kept her eyes forward, her spine straight, the boy's hand held firmly in hers. As they were about to enter the store, a voice, slick and sweet as poisoned honey, cut through the air. Well, look what the winter thawed out." A woman stood before them, blocking their path. She was dressed in expensive wool and fur, a stark contrast to the rough-hewn world of the ranch. Her face was powdered, her smile tight and unpleasant. She was the wife of the town's wealthiest merchant, a woman who wielded social standing like a weapon and ruled the town's small, vicious society with an iron fist. She was the town's social tyrant. She directed her smile at the man, but her eyes, cold and hard as river stones, were fixed on the woman and the boy. "I must say, I am surprised to see you keeping such unusual company. One hears stories, of course, but to see it so openly." Her voice was pitched to carry, to draw an audience. Several people on the street stopped to watch. The man's face, already a stoic mask, became utterly unreadable. He did not move. The social tyrant continued, her voice dripping with false concern. A man in your position, a grieving widower. It is understandable that you might be lonely. But to take in strays of this quality, she let the word hang in the air, thick with insinuation. She looked down her nose at the boy, and with a half-breed child, no less. People will talk. It is a disgrace to your poor wife's memory. The air grew thick with tension. This was the attack she had been waiting for. The public shaming meant to assert dominance and enforce the town's rigid, prejudiced order. The woman felt the blood drain from her face, but she did not flinch. She tightened her grip on her son's hand. The man had been silent for so long she thought he might not speak at all. Then he moved. He took one deliberate step forward, placing himself physically between the merchant's wife and his new family. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His quiet authority was more powerful than any shout. "They work for me," he said, his voice flat and cold as a blade. "They live on my land. They are under my protection." He met the woman's furious gaze without blinking. "Your business is not with them, and you will not speak of my wife." The finality in his tone was absolute. It was not a debate. It was a wall of granite. The social tyrant's face flushed a blotchy, ugly red. To be so publicly and quietly dismissed by this reclusive rancher was an insult she could not stomach. The small crowd of onlookers, who had been expecting a dramatic confrontation, were instead treated to a display of unshakable, quiet power. They looked away, suddenly uncomfortable. Furious and defeated, the antagonist gathered what was left of her dignity. "You will regret this," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. She turned on her heel and swept away, her expensive coat swirling behind her. The warning shot had been fired. The fragile piece of their isolated world had been shattered. They were now a public concern. The man turned, his expression grim. "Get what you need," he said to the woman, his voice rougher than usual. The silence in the wagon on the way home was heavier than it had ever been, freighted with the unspoken things that now lay between them. That night, the quiet in the cabin was different. It was not the peace of routine, but the tense silence of a coming storm. The fire crackled, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The boy was asleep in the loft, but the man and the woman sat at the table, the untouched remains of their dinner between them. The confrontation in town had changed something, brought the unsaid into the room, and given it weight. Finally, the woman broke the stillness. She looked at him, her gaze direct and searching. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why did you help us?" It was the question that had been sitting between them since that first day, the question she had been too afraid to ask. The man did not answer immediately. He stared into the fire, his hands resting on the rough wood of the table. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackling flames. He looked at the empty chair beside the hearth, the one nobody ever sat in, and a flicker of some deep, ancient pain crossed his face. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw, scraped clean of its usual stoicism. "I had a daughter," he began, his eyes still on the fire, "and a wife. They were everything. This place," he gestured vaguely at the cabin. "This place was full of noise. Laughter. My little girl singing off-key. My wife humming while she cooked. It wasn't a house. It was a home." He fell silent again, lost in the memory. The woman waited, her own heart aching in sympathy. "There was a fever 5 winters ago," he continued, his voice thick. "It came fast. Took my daughter in 3 days. My wife held on for a week longer. She died in my arms. Right there," he pointed toward the bed in the corner. After they were gone, the silence came. At first, it was a relief. A quiet place to grieve. But it stayed. And it got louder. A screaming silence, full of all the words I couldn't say, all the sounds that weren't there anymore. Too much nothing. He finally looked at her, his eyes hollowed out by the telling. "When I saw you in town, you and the boy, you had nothing left. I had too much nothing. I thought." He trailed off, struggling for the words. "I thought maybe if I brought you here, it would change the sound. I didn't do it to save you. I did it to save myself from the quiet." It was a confession of profound, selfish grief, but it was the most honest thing she had ever heard. He had not offered her charity. He had offered her a piece of his brokenness, hoping she could fill a crack in it. Moved by his raw vulnerability, She felt the walls around her own heart begin to crumble. He had shared his ghosts with her. It was only right that she share hers with him. I had a home once too, she said softly. She reached into a small pouch she always wore around her neck and pulled out a small, flat object wrapped in cloth. She unwrapped it carefully. In her palm lay a jade butterfly, its wing broken clean off. My husband gave this to me. He was a scholar from the East. A good man. A gentle man. He bought a small piece of land, a place he wanted to build a school. But a powerful man in that county wanted the land for himself. He was not a gentle man. Her voice was steady, but her hand trembled slightly as she held the broken pendant. My husband would not sell. He believed in the law, in contracts. He did not understand that for some men, the only law is their own greed. They came one night. They said my husband owed a debt. It was a lie, a forgery, but they had a judge in their pocket. When he protested, they killed him. They called it an accident. She looked up at the man, her eyes filled with a chilling clarity. The man who orchestrated it all, he told me that since my husband's debt was unpaid, all his assets were now forfeit. And that included me. And my son. He saw us as property. A debt to be collected, she swallowed hard. I ran. That night. I took my son and what little I could carry, and I just ran. We have been running ever since. Now he understood. The danger she was in was not poverty. It was a person, a specific, ruthless man who would not stop looking for what he considered his. The confrontation in town had been with a local bully. The true threat was still out there, a transactional villain who would one day come to collect. The exchange transformed their relationship. They were no longer just an employer and his hired help. They were two survivors, bound by shared loss and a common enemy in the world's cruelty. He looked at the woman and the boy, not as strays he had taken in, but as fellow soldiers in a war against the silence and the darkness. He realized then that he could no longer offer them just a roof. He had to offer them a fortress. The spring that followed was a fragile truce. The ranch, under the woman's quiet management and the man's relentless labor, began to feel less like a bastion of solitude and more like a functioning homestead. The garden she had planted yielded green shoots. The foreman and the few ranch hands the man employed, who had initially kept a cautious distance, began to see the woman not as the rancher's strange charity case, but as an indispensable part of the operation. Her quiet competence and the boy's cheerful, shy presence had slowly won them over. They became a silent, protective chorus around the small, unconventional family. But the truce was not to last. On a bright afternoon in late summer, when the air was warm and smelled of dust and curing hay, a shadow fell over the ranch. It came in the form of a fine, black carriage, pulled by two perfectly matched gray horses, a sight so out of place in this rugged landscape it felt like a hallucination. The carriage stopped in the yard. The man, who had been repairing a fence post, straightened up slowly, his hand resting on the handle of his hammer. The woman came to the cabin door, the boy peeking out from behind her skirts. A man stepped out of the carriage. He was impeccably dressed in a dark city suit, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. He was smiling, a thin, smug expression that did not reach his cold, calculating eyes. It was him, the transactional villain from her past, the man who saw people as entries on a ledger. A charmingly rustic little spot, the visitor said, his voice smooth and condescending as he surveyed the ranch. He looked past the man and fixed his gaze on the woman. I must say, you led me on quite a chase. But debts, my dear, always come due. He stepped forward, pulling a sheaf of papers from his coat pocket. I have here a legally binding debt bond, signed by your late husband. Upon his death, all his assets, tangible and otherwise, transferred to me to settle his accounts. That, I'm afraid, includes you and your son. He held the papers out as if they were a royal decree. I have spoken with the authorities. They are sympathetic to my claim. You have 3 days to prepare yourselves. I will return with the marshal to collect what is mine. It was an ultimatum, delivered with the supreme confidence of a man who had never lost. He did not wait for a reply. He simply tipped his hat, a gesture of mocking politeness, climbed back into his carriage, and was gone, leaving a cloud of dust and stunned silence in his wake. The next 3 days were a descent into a quiet, frantic desperation. The cabin became a war room. The threat was no longer a ghost from the past. It was a deadline. The man knew the kind of casual corruption the villain represented. A well-dressed man with a seemingly legal document could easily sway a town marshal eager to avoid trouble with a powerful figure. "He's a fraud," the woman said, her voice shaking but firm, as they sat at the table that first night. "My husband owed him nothing. That paper is a lie. A lie the law might believe," the man said grimly. Then, a flicker of memory sparked in her eyes. "My husband, he kept meticulous records. About everything. When I fled, I grabbed his papers. I don't know why. I just took them." She hurried to a small, battered trunk in the loft, the only possession she had brought with her besides the clothes on her back. She returned with a leather-bound folio filled with papers covered in dense, neat script. For the next 2 days, they pored over the documents. The man's practical knowledge of land deeds and water rights combined with a skill the woman had never had a chance to reveal. Her scholar husband had taught her accounting, how to read a balance sheet, how to spot the subtle tells of a forged contract. Her mind, sharp and logical, sifted through the numbers and legal jargon. Meanwhile, the man made a long-shot move. He rode hard to the nearest town with a telegraph office, a day's ride away. He remembered a man from his past, a signals officer from a war he never spoke of, a man who now held a high position with the telegraph company's regional office. He sent a coded message, brief and cryptic, a request for any and all information on the well-dressed villain, citing his full name and his business dealings in the Eastern Territories. It was a desperate gamble, a message in a bottle thrown into a vast ocean. The third day dawned, heavy and oppressive. There had been no reply to the telegraph. The woman, her face pale with exhaustion, had found inconsistencies in the villain's claims when cross-referenced with her husband's ledgers, but it was circumstantial, not the kind of ironclad proof that could stop a marshal. Hope was dwindling. Just after noon, they arrived. The black carriage was back, and beside it, on horseback, was the town marshal, his face grim and reluctant. And to witness her vindicated triumph, the social tyrant from town had come along as well, perched in the carriage like a vulture awaiting a feast. The villain stepped out, his smile wider and more confident than before. "Time is up," he announced cheerfully. "Marshal, if you would be so kind as to escort my property from the premises." The marshal dismounted, his hand on his pistol. He looked at the man, a flicker of regret in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low. "The paper looks legal. I have to enforce it." The man stepped in front of the cabin door, placing himself between the law and his family. He held no weapon. He simply stood there, an immovable object. "You're not taking them." The standoff was thick with tension. The villain laughed. "Brave, but foolish. Marshal, do your duty." Just as the marshal took a step forward, a sound broke the stillness. The frantic, desperate pounding of a horse's hooves, coming fast. A moment later, a rider on a lathered horse galloped into the yard. He was a young man from the telegraph office, and he was waving a piece of paper. "Telegram," he gasped, sliding from the saddle. "Urgent for the rancher. Came through from the territorial capital." He thrust the telegram into the man's hand. The villain's smile faltered for the first time. The man unfolded the paper, his face a mask of concentration as he read the coded dots and dashes of the message. The silence was absolute. When he finished, he looked up, his expression utterly devoid of emotion. He didn't speak. He simply walked over to the marshal and handed him the telegram. The marshal, confused, began to read. His eyebrows shot up. He read it again, his lips moving silently. Then a slow, hard look of dawning comprehension spread across his face. He looked from the paper to the smug villain, and his entire demeanor changed. The reluctance was gone, replaced by cold, hard anger. "Well, I'll be," the marshal said, his voice ringing with authority. He folded the telegram and tucked it into his coat. He turned to the villain. "It seems you're a man of some repute after all, wanted for fraud, forgery, and grand larceny in 2 territories. There's a federal warrant out for your arrest." The villain's face collapsed. The color drained from it, leaving a pasty, terrified mask. That's a lie. A trick," he stammered. "This telegram is from the U.S. Marshal's Service," the marshal said, pulling out his handcuffs. "I suggest you don't resist." The reversal was total and breathtaking. The social tyrant in the carriage stared in disbelief, her face a mask of humiliated fury. The villain, his arrogance shattered, was cuffed and roughly led away. As the marshal mounted his horse, he paused and looked at the rancher. He tipped his hat, a gesture of profound respect. "Looks like you had it handled," he said, and then he rode off, his prisoner in tow. The social tyrant, left alone and utterly defeated, shrieked at her driver to leave, and the carriage fled in a cloud of shame-filled dust. The man, the woman, and the boy were left standing in the quiet yard. The threat was gone. They were safe. The woman looked at the man, her eyes shining with tears she would not let fall. He looked back at her, and for the first time since she had met him, a small, slow smile touched the corners of his mouth. The spring that followed was not a truce, it was a rebirth. The ranch transformed. The oppressive silence that had once defined it was gone, replaced by the soft sounds of life. The boy's laughter echoed in the yard as he played with a puppy one of the ranch hands had given him. The scent of flowers from the woman's expanding garden mixed with the smells of baking bread and fresh-cut lumber. The man was no longer just a man at war with entropy. He was a builder. With the help of his foreman, he began adding a new room onto the cabin, a proper bedroom for the woman and the boy. The hammering was a joyful noise, a sound of growth and permanence. He was no longer defined by his grief. The emptiness in his eyes had been filled, not just by noise, but by purpose. He smiled more, spoke more, his words no longer just clipped commands but sentences that held the warmth of shared experience. The woman was no longer a refugee. She was the mistress of the homestead, a partner in every sense of the word. Her intelligence, once a hidden tool for survival, was now a celebrated asset. She managed the ranch's accounts, negotiated better prices for their cattle in town, and earned a reputation as a woman of formidable sense and dignity. The town, having witnessed the public humiliation of its social tyrant and the quiet triumph of the rancher's strange family, had shifted its opinion. Respect had replaced suspicion. The found family was now whole, forged in the crucible of winter and threat, and accepted by the world around them. The foreman and the hands were no longer just employees. They were uncles, fiercely protective and quietly proud. One evening, as the sun bled orange and purple across the vast sky, the three of them sat on the porch of the newly expanded cabin. The boy was leaning against the man's knee, whittling a piece of wood with a small, dull knife the man had given him. The woman sat beside them, her hands resting in her lap, a look of profound peace on her face. The silence that settled around them was a new kind, a comfortable, shared quiet that was full of unspoken affection. The man looked at the woman, her profile serene in the fading light, and then at the boy, his brow furrowed in concentration. He thought of the ghosts that had once haunted this place, the loud silence that had almost consumed him. They were still there, he knew, but they were no longer screaming. They were quiet whispers, memories that gave depth to the present, like the dark soil that nourished the bright flowers in the garden. "A home," he said softly, the words coming to him as a simple, unadorned truth, "is not the land you own. It is not the roof over your head." He looked at them, his family, the woman and boy he had taken in to cure his own loneliness and had come to love with a fierce, protective certainty. "It is the people you choose to protect on it." She met his gaze and smiled, a real, radiant smile that reached her eyes. And in that shared look, in the quiet of the coming night, the broken pieces of their separate lives finally, irrevocably, became one.